No one expects the past to appear at the most unexpected moment. But what if, on any given night, you met someone who completely changed your life? Someone who, years ago, was everything to you, but who now appears before your eyes in a way you never imagined. You are about to witness one of the most impactful stories of your life. Watch it until the end, and I assure you that your way of seeing life will never be the same again. That is exactly what happened to Ethan Carter, a real estate magnate, on a seemingly ordinary night. The hotel where he was dining was one of the most luxurious in Mexico City. However, among crystal glasses and refined dishes, something unexpected froze his world in a second. But wait. What would a man who had everything do when he saw his pregnant ex-wife working as a cleaner in a luxury hotel? Would he simply move on with his life, ignoring the past? Or would it awaken something in him that he had buried long ago? The answer is not so simple. There are encounters that cannot be ignored, moments that have the power to change everything, and Ethan was about to realize that some truths are impossible to avoid. The evening began like any other. Ethan was accompanied by his girlfriend, Sophie Bennett, an elegant and ambitious woman who knew how to move in the elite circle. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, Ethan walked with the confidence of someone who was always in control. The restaurant at the Emperor Grand Hotel was a symbol of exclusivity, a place where only the most influential were allowed. But at that moment, as he took in every detail of the ambience, an unexpected sound caught his attention, the soft creak of a cleaning cart. And that was when he saw her, Claire Sullivan. The shock was immediate. Her grey hotel employee uniform barely hid the evidence of her advanced pregnancy. Her hair, which had always been styled in sophisticated updos, was now simply tied back. But that wasn't what caught his attention. What really left Ethan speechless was the look in her eyes. There was no anger, no tears, just a calm dignity, as if he were just another customer. For a second that seemed to last an eternity, their eyes met. And in that instant, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: guilt. Sophie noticed the sudden change in Ethan's expression and frowned. "Are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Her voice sounded distant to him, drowned out by the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. How had Claire gotten to this point? When they'd first broken up, Ethan had made sure she got a generous financial settlement, or so he'd thought. But now, seeing her here, working as a cleaner and pregnant, he realized his view of the situation had been far from reality. Something was wrong. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied mechanically, looking away from Claire and trying to ignore the unexpected tightness in his chest. Sophie, satisfied with his answer, went back to talking about her plans for renovating their new apartment, but Ethan wasn't listening. His mind was stuck on that scene. Claire simply went about her work, as if he wasn't there, as if their years together had meant nothing. And for some reason, that bothered him more than he expected. During dinner, Ethan barely touched his food. The five-star restaurant, the refined background music, the expensive wine, none of it seemed to taste the same. His gaze kept returning to the kitchen door, waiting for her to pass by again. He couldn't help himself. He needed answers. He needed to understand how Claire had ended up here, carrying a child with someone he didn't even know. And most of all, he needed to know why this affected him so much. By the end of the evening, as the valet brought his luxury car around, Ethan had made a decision. Tomorrow, he would find out everything. He would call his personal assistant and ask for a full report on Claire. His business instincts had always been good at anticipating problems in business, and now he would apply that same approach to his personal life. He didn't know what he would find, but something inside him told him this meeting was no coincidence. The next morning, Ethan Carter arrived early at his office at Carter and Associates, one of the most influential real estate firms in the country. The panoramic view of the city from the 40th floor windows used to give him a sense of absolute control. But today, it meant nothing. His personal assistant, Daniel Reyes, entered the room with a folder in hand. "Here's the information you requested, Mr. Carter," he said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "But I think you should prepare yourself for what you're about to read." Ethan took the folder without a word and opened it. The first few pages were basic. Claire lived in a modest apartment in Colonia Narvarte, a far cry from the luxurious life they had once shared. Her job at the hotel was new, only 6 months, which suggested that something had changed drastically in her life recently. But it was when Ethan got to the financial details that his stomach sank. Claire had had to sell the apartment she had received in the divorce. The money had quickly gone toward medical bills and debts. She was completely broke. He leaned back in his chair, guilt rising inside him. How was this possible? He clearly remembered leaving Claire with more than enough resources, but then a detail in the report caught his eye. She had quit her job as a college professor right after the divorce. It didn't make sense. Claire was passionate about what she did. She would never have given up that career of her own free will. His gaze met Daniel's, who seemed to have anticipated his question. "Apparently, there were problems at the university," Daniel said cautiously. "Rumors started circulating, little whispers about her conduct with students, hints that her grades were questionable. Nothing concrete, but enough to tarnish her reputation. The university's administrators decided it would be best if she left." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He was familiar with this type of strategy. It was the same tactic used in the business world to force someone out without leaving any obvious traces of manipulation. This was no accident. Someone had done this to Claire, but who and why? Ethan closed the folder slowly, as if processing every detail he had just read. His mind was racing with possibilities. Claire had always been upright, dedicated, and passionate about teaching. There was no way these accusations were true, but if someone had forced her out, it had to be someone with influence, someone who had reason to want to see her ruined. An unpleasant possibility began to form in his mind, and he didn't like the conclusion he was coming to one bit. Sophie Bennett's name popped into his mind, and with it, an uncomfortable memory. He remembered how, right after the divorce, Sophie had become even more present in his life, always ready to support him as he recovered from the breakup. At the time, Ethan hadn't questioned it, but now it all seemed so convenient. Sophie had connections in the corporate world and knew exactly how the gears of power worked. Could it be that she had masterminded all of this behind the scenes? Ethan drummed his fingers on the table, anger rising. If Sophie had been behind Claire's downfall, he needed proof. He couldn't accuse her without knowing for sure. But if it was true, then he had made an even bigger mistake than he realized. Not only had he abandoned Claire, but he had allowed his life to be destroyed while he had moved on without looking back. He stood abruptly, picking up the phone and dialing Daniel. "I want you to find out who started these rumors about Claire," he ordered. "Find any connections to any name that might lead back to Sophie Bennett." His voice was firm, cold, and filled with determination. Daniel nodded on the other end of the line. "I'll take care of it right away, Mr. Carter." Ethan hung up and looked out at the city through the glass windows. He'd never known he'd left Claire behind on a battlefield. Now he would do whatever it took to find out the truth. While he waited for Daniel's investigation, Ethan couldn't focus on anything else. His routine, which had previously revolved around meetings, contracts, and million-dollar investments, now seemed insignificant. The past was coming back to haunt him, and he couldn't just ignore it. At the end of the day, he got in his car and drove aimlessly through the city until he realized that his destination was not random. He was in Colonia Narvarte, the neighborhood where Claire now lived. Parked across the street, he stared at the small, plain-looking building. Nothing about it reminded him of the luxurious life she had lived with him. The thought bothered him more than it should have. Claire had always been independent, never asked for anything, but seeing her reduced to this made him feel a weight he couldn't bear. She should have been teaching, inspiring students, building the future. Instead, she was cleaning hotel rooms to make ends meet. A few minutes later, the lights in one of the second-floor apartments came on. Then he saw her. Claire appeared at the window, dressed comfortably, holding a cup of tea. For a moment, Ethan could see her as she had before, serene, lost in thought, the same woman he had once loved. But then his eyes dropped to her belly. The baby, the detail he couldn't quite process yet. Who was the father? How had she ended up here? His cell phone vibrated on the dashboard, bringing him back to reality. It was a message from Daniel. "We need to talk. I found something important." Ethan wasted no time. He started the car and drove away, feeling that the answers he had been searching for were getting closer and closer, and something told him that he wasn't going to like what he was about to discover. Ethan arrived at his office a few minutes later to find Daniel already waiting for him. His assistant looked tense, holding a tablet with a few documents open. "What did you find?" Ethan asked, getting straight to the point. Daniel took a deep breath before answering. "The information adds up. The rumors about Claire started right after the divorce and were quietly spread by people connected to a very specific group. They all have direct connections to Sophie Bennett." Ethan's blood boiled. He picked up his tablet and began scrolling through the records. There were emails, texts, money transfers to people who had clearly helped tarnish Claire's reputation. The evidence was clear. Sophie hadn't just known what was happening, she'd orchestrated it all. She destroyed Claire's career. Why? Out of revenge? Out of jealousy? Ethan ran a hand over his face, trying to control the fury rising inside him, but Daniel hesitated before answering. "Sir, there's one more thing." He slid the tablet over to show another file. It was a medical document. "We've been able to access some public prenatal records. Claire is 7 months pregnant." Ethan frowned, not understanding the relevance of that until Daniel continued, "If we do the math, this baby was conceived 3 months after the divorce." The information hit him like a punch in the gut. Ethan felt the ground disappear for a moment. The timing was too close. He remembered the last time he had been with Claire, that 1-week night, when the divorce papers had already been signed, but his emotions were still raw. A goodbye, a mistake, or something more. Ethan stared at the screen, feeling an undeniable truth grow inside him. There was a good chance that this baby was his. The shock of the discovery was still reverberating in his mind as Ethan slumped in his chair, staring into space. If the baby was his, then that changed everything. The divorce, the separation, Claire's downfall. None of it was as he had thought. He hadn't just abandoned her. He'd left her alone, pregnant, without support, while her life was deliberately destroyed, and he hadn't even suspected. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have seen what was happening right under his nose? But now was not the time to dwell on the past. He needed certainty. He took a deep breath and picked up the phone. "Daniel, find out what Claire's work schedule is at the hotel. I want to see her in person." He needed to talk to her, face to face. There was no more room for doubts or secrets. If this baby was really his, he would not let Claire spend another day in this situation without knowing that she could count on him. That night, He couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through all the possibilities. He remembered Claire from the past, how she always said she wanted a family, that she dreamed of being a mother. At the time he ignored it, always too busy with his business, thinking they could wait. But now, everything was happening without him. And the idea of having a child and not being a part of his life scared him more than any million-dollar negotiation he had ever faced. The next morning, Ethan drove straight to the Emperor Grand Hotel, dressed in a suit that was understated but still too flashy to go unnoticed. When he walked in, he ignored the luxurious lobby and headed straight for the staff corridors. His heart raced when he spotted Claire at the end of the hall, pushing a cleaning cart. The moment was surreal. She didn't even look at him, focused on her work, but Ethan couldn't wait any longer. "Claire!" His voice echoed in the quiet hallway. She stopped, but didn't turn around right away. When she finally did, her gaze was impassive, as if just seeing him there didn't matter at all. But for Ethan, that moment carried the weight of years of regret. For a moment, the silence between them was absolute. Claire held tightly to the handle of the cleaning cart, as if it were her only anchor to reality. Ethan, on the other hand, felt the weight of every word he hadn't said in the past few years. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than he'd intended. Claire took a deep breath and crossed her arms, keeping her expression cool. "If it's about the hotel, you can talk to the management." Ethan felt the sting of her rejection. She was protecting herself, and rightly so. He was no longer a part of her life, and now he was just a ghost from the past who would resurface without warning. But he couldn't give up. "It's not about the hotel, it's about you and the baby." He saw her gaze harden instantly. Claire glanced around quickly, making sure no one was listening. "This is none of your business, Ethan." But it was. He knew it was. "I've done the math, Claire." His voice was firm, heavy with a weight even he couldn't control. "I know there's a chance this baby could be mine." Claire looked away, her lips pressed together. She didn't deny it. Ethan took a step forward but stopped himself. "If it's true, if this baby is mine, I need to know." Claire closed her eyes for a second, as if gathering her strength. When she looked back at him, there was something different about her. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was weariness. "What if it is?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. "What would you do, Ethan? Try to buy our child the same way you bought your way away from me." The blow was true. Ethan felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. She didn't just want him to know the truth. She wanted to know if he deserved it. Ethan swallowed. He knew he deserved this blow, but he couldn't back down now. "It's not about the money, Claire. I just want to understand." His voice came out quieter than he'd intended, and for the first time he realized how true that was. He didn't just want to know if the baby was his. He wanted to understand everything that had happened, everything he'd missed while living in his bubble of success and arrogance. Claire studied him for a moment as if trying to decipher his intentions. Then she took a deep breath and looked around. "Not here." Her tone was still cool, but Ethan could hear the slight hesitation, a sign that she wasn't going to reject him outright. "My shift ends in an hour. If you want to talk, I'll be at the coffee shop next to the hotel." It was a test. He knew that. Claire wouldn't give him anything for free. He would have to prove that he was here for something real. Ethan just nodded. He didn't thank her. He didn't insist. He just turned on his heel and left. He knew every second leading up to that meeting would be excruciating. But he also knew that this might be his only chance to fix what was broken. For the next 60 minutes, He could do nothing but think about what he would say. How could he convince her that he wasn't the same man who had abandoned her? How could he show her that for the first time in years he was willing to listen, not just talk? When the hour finally passed, Ethan walked into the coffee shop and saw her sitting by the window, her hands clasped together on the table. She looked different than he remembered, stronger, tougher. She was no longer the Claire who waited for him to get home late from work, who smiled at elite parties to look like the perfect wife. She was a woman who had survived without him, and in that moment, Ethan realized that he wasn't the one holding the power in this conversation. She was. Ethan approached the table cautiously, feeling the invisible weight of the past between them. Claire said nothing as he pulled out his chair and sat down. She just watched, as if waiting for him to break the silence first. And he did. "Thank you for giving me this talk," he said, trying to measure his words. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I had to come." Claire let out a short, humorless laugh. "Did you have to?" she repeated, crossing her arms. "Ethan, you haven't looked back in years. Then you see me at the hotel and decide, you need to talk to me? What's changed?" He closed his eyes for a second, trying to find the right answer, but there was no perfect answer, only the truth. "I was an idiot," he admitted finally, looking her straight in the eye. "I thought I was doing the right thing, that if I left you with enough money, you'd be okay. But now I see I had no idea what was happening to you." Claire looked away, as if his confession had caught her off guard. He leaned forward a little. "I'm not here to justify anything, but I want to know the truth. I want to know about the baby." She was silent for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and placed her hands over her stomach, as if bracing herself for the impact of what she would say next. "Yes, Ethan." Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "The baby is yours." Claire's words hung in the air like a silent punch to Ethan's chest. He knew it. Deep down, from the moment he'd started putting the pieces together, he'd known it was the truth. But hearing it from her lips made it all real. A whirlwind of emotions hit him all at once: shock, guilt, fear, and most of all, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He was going to be a father. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Claire let out a bitter laugh. "Are you serious?" She shook her head in disbelief. "You moved on, Ethan. You married your business and a woman who made a point of erasing me from her life. Tell me, if I had come to you, would you have listened?" Ethan opened his mouth, but he couldn't answer right away, because deep down he knew Claire was right. Back then, he would have ignored it. He would have seen the pregnancy as a problem, something that would get in the way of his new life, his new plans. And now all he could think about was what he had lost. "I can't change the past," he said finally, his voice lowering. "But I can change what happens from now on." Claire raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you think you can do now, Ethan? Do you think you can just show up and take on the role of father like nothing ever happened?" The coldness in her voice cut deep, but Ethan didn't back down. "No, I know it's going to take time, but I want to try. I want to be present." He looked down at her belly, his chest tightening with a new weight. "Let me prove to you that I can be different." Claire studied Ethan for a long moment, as if trying to decipher whether his words held any real weight or were just empty promises. Once she would have believed him without hesitation, but now she was a woman who had learned not to trust so easily. "And what does being there mean to you, Ethan?" she asked, her voice thick with skepticism. "Because I don't need money. I don't need charity, and I definitely don't need you to come and go from my son's life whenever you please." He felt the blow, but he didn't look away. I'm not talking about money, Claire. This time, his voice was firm. I want to be a part of his life. I want to be here, no matter what happens between us. Claire crossed her arms, still resistant. What about Sophie? She thrust the question like a sharp knife. Do you think she'll accept this? Do you think this woman who did everything she could to erase me will just accept that you have a connection with me now? Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. He knew Claire was right. Sophie wouldn't accept that so easily. But he saw things differently now. I don't care what Sophie thinks, he said, opening his eyes again. What matters now is you and this baby. The rest, I'll figure it out. Claire let out a heavy sigh and looked away, staring at the cup of coffee in front of her. You always liked to think you could fix everything, Ethan. The silence between them stretched for a few seconds, but this time it wasn't an angry silence. It was a silence of a past full of failures, an uncertain present, and a future that neither of them knew how to deal with. Claire, finally, leaned back in her chair and looked at him. If you really want to be a part of this, you're going to have to prove it. Not with words, but with actions. Ethan nodded slowly. I will. For the first time in a long time, he said something with complete certainty, but he didn't yet know that this decision would change everything. Ethan left the coffee shop feeling the weight of the conversation still on his shoulders. He knew Claire wouldn't just accept him back into her life, much less allow him into the baby's life without a fight, but there was no turning back now. He wanted to be a part of this, and he would do whatever it took to prove it. However, there was one other issue he needed to resolve first: Sophie. On the way back to the office, Ethan picked up the phone and called Sophie directly. We need to talk, he said bluntly. On the other end of the line, she hesitated for a second before answering. Is something wrong, love? Her sweet, measured tone didn't go unnoticed by him. Ethan took a deep breath, controlling the anger that was building inside him. Not on the phone. Meet me at my apartment in an hour. He hung up before she could say anything. When he got home, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out at the panoramic view from his luxury apartment. What he was about to do could change his life forever. But perhaps, for the first time, he was ready for it. When Sophie arrived, wearing one of the fancy dresses he used to admire, she smiled and walked over to him, as she always did, but this time Ethan didn't return the gesture. What's going on? She asked, her smile faltering. He set the glass down and stared at her. I know everything, Sophie. The words were spoken with a coldness that made her smile disappear completely. I know what you did to Claire. I know you were the one who spread the rumors at the university. I know you destroyed her career so she would be forced out of my life. Sophie blinked, looking surprised for a second, but then her expression changed. She crossed her arms and let out a low laugh. What if I did? What are you going to do about it, Ethan? Ethan felt a wave of revulsion run through his body at Sophie's response. She didn't even try to deny it. On the contrary, she seemed almost amused by the situation. So you admit it? He asked, his voice filled with a coldness that he himself barely recognized. Sophie shrugged, picking up a glass of wine, as if none of this was serious. I admit that I did what was necessary for you to finally see who really fits into your world. Claire was a dead weight, Ethan, a woman who didn't understand what it meant to be by your side. His blood boiled. Every word that came out of her mouth only confirmed what he feared. You destroyed her life out of jealousy, she said, clenching her fists. Sophie rolled her eyes and took a sip of her wine. Don't be so dramatic. I just got someone out of the way. If she was as strong as you think she is, she would have gotten through this. Ethan felt a deep anger rise inside him. He had allowed this woman into his life. He had trusted her. But now he saw Sophie for who she really was. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "It's over, Sophie." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I'm out. You and we're done." Sophie blinked a few times, as if processing his words. Then she let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You think you can just discard me like that, after everything we've built?" Her eyes narrowed. "You forget that I know a lot about you, about your business, your dealings." Ethan was undeterred. Instead, he smiled darkly. "And you forget who I am, Sophie. Do you really think I didn't protect myself?" He turned and picked up an envelope from the table, tossing it to her. "Inside is a detailed report of your transactions over the past few years. Misappropriated funds, shady dealings. You have a lot more to lose than I do." Sophie took the envelope and quickly opened it. Her expression changed instantly. She realized that this time she had lost. Sophie was silent for a few seconds, her gaze growing increasingly tense as she studied the documents. Her once confident and arrogant posture began to falter. Ethan watched every little change in her expression and knew in that moment that she had no choice but to leave. "You set me up?" she finally whispered, her voice now thick with disbelief. Ethan crossed his arms. "No, you did it yourself. I just made sure I had the proof when the time was right." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, the tone now gone from defiance to exhaustion and frustration. "I want you out of my life," he answered without hesitation. "No scandals, no threats. Take what's left of your dignity and leave while you still can." Sophie clutched the documents tightly, her eyes shining with suppressed anger. But deep down, she knew she had no choice. After a long silence, she huffed and threw the papers on the table. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice thick with venom. "If you think Claire and this baby are going to give you the happy ending you want, you're wrong." Ethan didn't react. He just kept his gaze fixed on her. "What I want, Sophie, is not a happy ending. It's a new beginning. And it starts now, without you." Sophie let out a dry laugh and grabbed her bag. Without another word, she turned and left the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling a huge weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt free. But there was still something much more important he needed to resolve. Claire, the baby, the future. Now, with no shadows of the past interfering, he was ready to face what really mattered. The next morning, Ethan drove straight to Claire's apartment. This time, he wouldn't wait any longer. He wouldn't let any more time go to waste. When he arrived at the small building in Colonia Narvarte, he felt something strange, a feeling he hadn't recognized in a long time. Insecurity. This wasn't a deal, a merger, a contract. This was something he couldn't simply control with money or influence. This was real life. He walked up the stairs and knocked on the door. Seconds later, Claire opened it. She was wearing jeans and a loose blouse, visibly tired, but still with that strong presence she always had. Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire sighed. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" Her voice was not aggressive, but it carried an emotional weariness that he recognized immediately. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and took a deep breath before speaking. "I broke up with Sophie," he said bluntly. Claire blinked, clearly surprised. "And what does that have to do with me?" He took a step forward. "It has to do with everything, Claire. I've gotten rid of everything that was in the way. Now there are no more distractions, no more excuses." He looked straight at her belly. I want to be here, I really do." Claire crossed her arms, clearly still wary. "And why should I believe you now? Because you had an epiphany and decided you want to be a father?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't expect you to believe me now, but I'm here to prove in time that I'm not the same man who left you behind." He swallowed hard. "I want to be a part of that, Claire, if you'll let me." Claire stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to find some crack in his conviction, any sign that his words were just empty promises. But this time, Ethan didn't look away. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to persuade. He was here because he wanted to, because he needed to. Finally, Claire let out a sigh and unfolded her arms. "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan. Not after everything." He nodded slowly. It was fair. He knew he couldn't just go back and expect everything to be forgiven right away. "I don't blame you for that," he said truthfully, "and I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I just want the chance to prove that I can be a father to this baby." Claire bit her bottom lip, clearly conflicted. Part of her still wanted to keep him at bay, protect herself from further disappointment. But there was another part, a part that wanted to believe that Ethan could, in fact, be different. She looked down at her stomach and ran a hand over it gently. "I spent months trying to accept that I would have to do this alone," she admitted, "that my child's father would never be around. I prepared myself for this. I built my life around this idea." When she looked back up at him, her eyes were filled with emotion. "Now you come along and want to change everything. This isn't easy for me, Ethan." Ethan felt the weight of her words. He wasn't the only one trying to readjust to this new reality. Claire had spent months alone, carrying this baby without any support, mentally, preparing herself for a future where he didn't exist. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice softer, "but it doesn't have to be all at once. I just want you to let me try. No pressure, no expectations." Claire took a deep breath, considering his words. After a long silence, she finally nodded. "Okay, Ethan, let's see if you really want this." Over the next few days, Ethan made sure to show that he wasn't just there for words. He showed up. He called Claire to see if she needed anything, asked about her tests, and asked how she was feeling. At first, she kept her guard up, but as the days went by, her resistance began to ease a little. Small gestures, like bringing her something to eat or offering her a ride to the doctor, began to become routine. He was trying. One night, Claire was organizing some baby clothes when her phone rang. It was Ethan. "I just wanted to know if you needed anything," he said, and his voice sounded different. There was something besides the usual concern. "Actually, I'm fine," she replied hesitantly. "But are you okay?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Ethan sighed. "It's weird," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life building things, controlling everything around me. But now, for the first time, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing." Claire leaned back against the couch, feeling his sincerity come through the phone. "Welcome to the real world," she said with a small smile. "The difference is, some things you can't plan, Ethan. Some things you just live." The silence on the other end wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held understanding, something they hadn't shared in a long time. The next day, Ethan showed up at her apartment door with an envelope in his hand. "What's this?" Claire asked, taking the paper suspiciously. He shoved his hands in his pockets nervously. "I went to the university," he said. "I talked to a few people. I explained what happened. They want to offer you a position back." Claire's eyes widened. She didn't know what to say. Everything that had been taken from her, Ethan was trying to give back. But did she want that? Could she accept this part of her past back after everything? Claire held the envelope for a long moment, emotions swirling inside her. For months, she had accepted that her career was ruined, that she would never be the woman she loved teaching again. But now Ethan was here, offering her an opportunity she never thought she would. Get back. Part of her wanted to refuse, to prove that she didn't need anything from him. But at the same time, she knew this wasn't about pride. It was about her future. Her son's future. She took a deep breath and looked at him. Do you think you can fix everything like that, Ethan? One job, a few phone calls, and that's it. Do you think you can just erase what happened? Her voice wasn't harsh, but it held the pain she still felt. Ethan shook his head. I don't think I can erase anything. Claire, but I can try to fix it. I can try to make something right after so many bad decisions. She looked at the envelope again, then at Ethan. For the first time, she saw something different in him. He wasn't the arrogant, cold man who had once left her behind. He was a man who was trying. Maybe he would never be perfect. Maybe they could never go back to the way they were. But there was something that would bind them together forever now. I'll think about it, she said, her voice softer. But no matter what I decide, I need you to understand something, Ethan. What matters most right now is not the past. It's what you do in the future. Ethan nodded, understanding what she meant. I know. And I'll be here, Claire. No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. This time he wasn't just saying words. He really wanted to be a father. He wanted to be someone better. Claire watched him for a moment before giving him a small, almost imperceptible smile. Maybe, just maybe, a new beginning was possible, not like before, but in a different way, and for the first time she felt like she wasn't alone. Months passed, and Claire realized that even without grand promises or extravagant gestures, Ethan was there, present. He didn't try to rush anything. He didn't demand immediate trust. He just made himself present, and over time, this was the biggest sign that he had truly changed. When the day of the birth arrived, Ethan was by her side, holding her hand, nervous, excited, ready to take on the role he once thought he would never have. Life had taken unexpected turns, but there, holding the little baby in his arms, he knew that this was the only thing that truly mattered. The past could not be changed, but the future that he could still build. Quote of the day: second chances aren't about erasing the past, they're about building a different future. This story isn't over yet. What does the future hold for Ethan, Claire, and their baby? To make sure you don't miss the sequel, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. Comment here which city you're watching from.